'Twas the summer of 1997, and the city mall was alive with the usual noise of weekend crowds. Families walked in with shopping bags, children clung to their parents, and teenagers laughed as they carried sodas and snacks from the food court. For many, the mall was the safest place to spend a Saturday afternoon. Nobody could have guessed that this ordinary day would become one of the darkest chapters in the city's history. That morning, 5 children, from 5 different families, had gone to the mall for simple reasons. One boy wanted to buy a toy, car he had been saving his pocket money for. A girl had begged her mother to take her to the bookstore for a new fairy tale collection. Another child was excited to visit the arcade with his cousins, while the remaining 2 were there with their parents to pick out birthday gifts. Each of them stepped into that busy mall with joy and excitement, but by the evening, all 5 of them would be gone. The mall was unusually crowded that day. It was the start of summer vacations, and many families thought it was the perfect time to shop for clothes and enjoy a meal together. Security guards stood at the entrances, checking bags, while shoppers rushed in and out. Nobody noticed that, among the hundreds of smiling faces, a storm of fear and sorrow was about to begin. The first sign that something was wrong came in the early afternoon. A mother, holding her shopping bags, suddenly realized her 7-year-old daughter was no longer walking beside her. At first, she assumed the child had stopped to look at a window display. She retraced her steps expecting to see her daughter standing near a toy shop. But the little girl wasn't there. Her heart began to beat faster, and she called out her child's name, her voice shaky with worry. Shoppers turned their heads but went back to their own business, thinking it was a momentary slip. The mother rushed to the information desk, her face pale, asking for an announcement over the mall's speakers. Not long after, another parent approached security. Their son, who had been playing in the arcade, had vanished. The child had been seen just minutes earlier, laughing and winning tickets from a game machine. But when the father returned from the restroom, the boy was gone. At first, people thought maybe the boy had simply wandered to another store. But when guards checked nearby shops, no one had seen him. By late afternoon, panic spread as more parents reported missing children. 5 children in total had disappeared from different parts of the mall within just a few hours. The mall's staff tried to calm the parents, saying perhaps the kids had gathered together in the food court or were playing in a corner of the arcade. But when security guards checked every floor, every restroom, and every hallway, the children were nowhere to be found. The police were called immediately. Officers arrived in large numbers, sealing all exits of the mall. Announcements echoed through the loudspeakers. Attention shoppers, please remain calm, a search is being conducted. Shoppers froze in confusion. Some gathered in small groups, whispering rumors, while others clutched their own children tightly, afraid to let them out of sight. Within minutes, what had started as a lively, joyful day turned into a place of fear and suspicion. Detectives quickly took charge, ordering the review of surveillance tapes. Dozens of monitors showed grainy black and white images of people moving in and out of stores, families laughing in food courts, and teenagers carrying shopping bags. But when investigators tried to track the 5 missing children through the cameras, something unsettling appeared. Each of them was seen entering the mall, walking around with their families. But the footage that should have shown them later simply vanished. It was as if the children had walked into thin air. Parents cried out, begging the officers for answers. Some screamed in frustration, while others simply collapsed in tears. The mall that had once been considered a safe place was now surrounded by police cars, flashing lights, and reporters trying to capture the unfolding tragedy. News spread across the city within hours, and television stations interrupted their regular programs to report on the shocking incident. The words 5 children missing appeared in bold on every screen, and families across the country sat in disbelief. That night, the mall was kept closed, and every corner was searched. Police dogs sniffed through storage rooms, locked doors, were forced open, and abandoned shopping bags were carefully examined. Yet not a single clue was found. The belongings of the missing children, shoes, toys, or personal items, were nowhere in sight. Outside the mall, dozens of people gathered, holding candles and praying for the safe return of the children. Strangers offered comfort to the devastated, Families, while journalists pushed microphones forward, asking heartbreaking questions that no parent wanted to hear. The city that had always felt safe suddenly felt dangerous, and parents began holding their children's hands tighter than ever before. As the night wore on, officers tried to piece together what could have happened. Some believed the children might have wandered together and gotten lost in a hidden area of the mall. Others suspected something far darker, that someone had been carefully watching and waiting for the right moment to take them. But without evidence, all they had were questions. By midnight, the families of the missing children were escorted home by officers, though none of them wanted to leave. Mothers clung to the hope that their children would walk back through the doors at any moment, smiling and safe. Fathers, though broken, promised they would not stop until answers were found. That first night of searching ended with no discovery, but it marked the beginning of one of the most haunting mysteries the city had ever faced. The disappearance of those 5 innocent children from a crowded mall, under the watch of cameras and guards, became a puzzle that no one could solve. For the parents, every passing hour felt like a lifetime. For the community, the mall was no longer just a shopping center. It was a place of unanswered questions, fear, and deep sorrow. And though investigators swore they would find the truth, no one realized that the answers would remain hidden, buried beneath years of silence until nearly 3 decades later. After the first year passed without answers, the city slowly returned to its daily routine, but the families of the 5 missing children could never return to normal. Every day began with the same ache in their hearts and ended with the same unanswered question: where were their children? Police officers had promised to continue searching, but with each passing month, fewer detectives were assigned to the case. The calls from investigators grew less frequent, and soon the families found themselves facing silence from the very people they once depended on. Life continued, but it was never the same. Some parents kept their children's bedrooms exactly as they had left them in 1997. Toys remained neatly arranged, school books stayed stacked on desks, and posters on the walls gathered dust as the years slipped away. They refused to change anything, believing that one day their missing child might walk back through the door. Others kept boxes of their children's clothes in storage, unable to let go, clinging to the hope of reunion. As years turned into a decade, the case of the Mall 5 became a shadow that lingered over the city. For a while, it was talked about in every household, but slowly, new events took over the headlines. Other stories captured public attention, and life moved on for most people. Yet for the 5 families, the wound remained open. They attended community vigils, they appeared on talk shows, and they begged anyone who would listen to remember their children. But as the crowds thinned, they were left mostly alone with their grief. Detectives who had once been energetic about solving the case eventually retired or moved on to other work. The younger officers who came later knew about the case only as a story in the archives. Thick files filled with interviews, blurry photographs, and endless notes sat on shelves gathering dust. Every few years, someone in the police department would take another look, recheck the evidence, and then place the files back in storage, defeated once again by the lack of leads. Technology, however, was changing rapidly. By the mid-2000s, DNA testing had become more advanced. Computer systems made it easier to compare evidence across states and even countries. The families begged authorities to use these tools on the old case, but without physical evidence from the children, there was little that could be tested. The disappearance had left behind nothing: no clothing, no belongings, no traces. It was as if the mall itself had swallowed the children whole. Some of the parents tried to continue their lives while carrying their silent grief. A few became activists, raising awareness about missing children across the country. They spoke at schools, organized community events, and pushed for better security systems in malls and public places. Others turned inward, choosing a quieter path, keeping their pain private. Friendships between the families grew strong during this time. They leaned on one another, knowing only those who had lived through the same nightmare could truly understand the depth of their loss. The years stretched on. By 2010, 13 years had passed since the children vanished. The world was different now. Cell phones were common, Social media connected people instantly, and new technologies allowed cases to be shared widely online. Younger generations stumbled across the old story and became fascinated by the mystery. Online forums filled with theories, some thoughtful, some wild. People speculated about secret rooms in the mall, about organized groups, or even about connections to other unsolved cases. The truth, however, remained hidden, and speculation only deepened the frustration of the families. The mall itself changed as well. In the early years, people avoided it, but eventually, shoppers returned. New stores opened, old ones closed, and the bright lights once again invited families inside. Yet beneath the laughter and the sound of music from the food court, there was always an uneasy feeling. Employees who worked late nights sometimes said the halls felt heavy with silence, as if the building carried the weight of what had happened. The story of the missing children lingered in whispers, passed on by new workers who learned of the tragedy only after being hired. 2 decades after the disappearance, the case was considered one of the most haunting cold cases in the city's history. Every anniversary, newspapers printed small reminders of the tragedy. Photographs of the children, digitally aged to show what they might look like as adults, were shared with the public. Parents looked at those pictures with both hope and pain, wondering if their children were out there somewhere, alive but unable to return home. Each year's anniversary reopened the wound, but the families clung to the hope that one day the truth would come out. Some of the parents did not live long enough to see that day. The years of grief wore heavily on them. A father passed away quietly in his sleep, holding a framed picture of his son. A mother, frail from illness, left behind a diary filled with letters to her missing daughter, each one ending with the same promise: "I will see you again." The surviving parents carried not only their own grief, but also the burden of those who had gone before them, determined to keep the memory alive. For the detectives who still remembered the case, it remained a ghost they could not shake. Some admitted they often lay awake at night thinking about it. They had solved hundreds of other mysteries, but this one remained untouched. No matter how much effort they had poured into it, the children had vanished without leaving a single trace. It was a mystery that defied explanation, a wound that time could not heal. By 2020, 23 years had passed. The city had grown, technology had advanced, and the world faced new challenges. Yet the story of the 5 children was never forgotten. Documentaries were made, podcasts retold the story, and writers revisited the tragedy, trying to keep the memory alive. For many listeners and viewers, it was just another mystery, but for the families, it was a living nightmare that had no ending. Then came the year 2025. Almost 3 decades had slipped away since that summer afternoon in 1997. Most people believed the mystery would never be solved, that it would remain a cold case buried in old files and fading memories. But history has a strange way of bringing the past back when least expected. In the silence of those years beneath the surface of time, the truth had been waiting. And when it finally came to light, it would shake the city, reopen old wounds, and rewrite everything that investigators thought they knew about the disappearance of the Mall 5. The morning after the 5 children vanished, the mall was surrounded by police cars, flashing lights, and curious onlookers. Reporters gathered outside, their cameras pointed toward the glass doors, waiting for updates. Inside, detectives moved, with urgency, speaking to frightened parents and nervous employees. The city had never faced such a case before, and the weight of finding the children pressed heavily on every officer's shoulders. Detectives began their investigation by speaking with the parents. Each family described the last time they saw their child. One mother recalled her daughter asking if she could stop by the bookstore. Another father remembered watching his son laughing in the arcade. Each detail seemed small, but detectives hoped that by piecing them together, they could find a pattern. Yet when they compared the stories, there was no single location or shop where all 5 children had been at the same time. They had vanished separately from different corners of the mall, which made the mystery even harder to solve. The security footage was examined again and again. Investigators froze the tapes, replayed them, and zoomed in on blurred figures. They watched the children enter the mall with their families, saw them walking, playing, or shopping, but in every case, the children disappeared from the footage without any clear explanation. One boy was seen in the arcade holding a handful of tickets, but the next moment when the camera should have shown him leaving the area, the child was gone. A girl was captured on camera holding her mother's hand near a toy store, and then, almost like a trick of the eye, the child was no longer visible. Detectives wondered if the cameras had failed at just the wrong times, but technicians checked, and there was no sign of malfunction. The machines had been recording continuously, yet somehow the moments that mattered most showed nothing. It was as if the children had simply melted into the crowd and vanished. Officers began questioning every person who had been in the mall that day. Shopkeepers, employees, and security guards were interviewed one by one. Some recalled seeing children running past their stores. A few said they heard laughter near the arcade. But when asked if they remembered anyone leading the children away, no one had an answer. The only suspicious report came from a teenage cashier who mentioned seeing a white van parked strangely near the loading dock at the back of the mall. She said it looked out of place, but she couldn't remember the license plate or the driver. Detectives considered this lead carefully, but when they searched the area, the van was gone, and no one else had noticed it. Day after day, the investigation grew wider. Police searched nearby neighborhoods, abandoned buildings, and even drainage tunnels. Flyers with the children's pictures were distributed across the city, showing their bright smiles and small faces. Volunteers joined the search, combing through parks, fields, and riversides, holding on to the hope that the children might have wandered away and gotten lost. But every search ended the same, empty-handed. The families lived in constant grief. Each morning, parents woke with the desperate wish that their child would be found that day. They sat by the phone, waiting for calls from detectives, dreading the silence that often followed. Some of them refused to leave their houses, hoping that if the children returned, they would be there to welcome them. Others joined the police in the search, walking miles through neighborhoods, knocking on doors, and showing pictures of their missing sons and daughters. The city itself began to change. Parents became more protective, holding their children's hands tightly in public places. The mall, once filled with laughter and shopping bags, turned into a place of unease. Many families avoided it altogether, saying it felt haunted by sadness. Shopkeepers struggled to keep business alive as people no longer trusted the mall to be safe. Weeks turned into months, and still there were no answers. Detectives chased dozens of leads, but each one ended in disappointment. A man reported seeing a group of children near a bus station, but when police arrived, the children were strangers. Someone else claimed to have spotted kids matching the description in another city, but the report turned out to be false. Every rumor raised hope in the parents' hearts, only to crush them when the truth was revealed. Theories began to spread, both in the media and among the public. Some believed that the children had been taken by someone who had studied the mall carefully, waiting for the perfect moment. Others suspected that the case might be linked to older missing person cases from years before. But none of these theories were proven. Without evidence, the detectives could not point to any single explanation. As the investigation dragged on, the families' lives grew heavier. Birthdays passed, without candles being blown out. Holidays came and went with empty chairs at the table, and school years began without the missing children. The parents clung to hope, but the pain of not knowing grew with each passing day. They often gathered together, supporting one another through shared sorrow. Sometimes they lit candles at the mall entrance. Sometimes they stood in silence holding pictures of their children, and sometimes they simply cried together. Detectives, too, carried the weight of failure. Many of them admitted privately that it was the most difficult case they had ever worked on. They had searched every lead, every clue, and every corner of the city, yet nothing made sense. How could 5 children vanish in a crowded mall, surrounded by cameras and security without anyone noticing? It was a question that haunted the investigation. Years passed, and still the case remained unsolved. The files grew thicker with reports, interviews, and photographs, but the answers never came. Detectives were reassigned to other cases, and, eventually, the Mall 5 investigation became known as a cold case. The parents, though heartbroken, never gave up completely. Some of them continued to push for answers, writing letters to officials, asking for the case to be reopened, while others quietly carried their grief through the years. The tragedy left a permanent scar on the community. Even decades later, people who had been there remember the announcements echoing through the mall that day, the sight of parents crying, and the confusion of shoppers. The memory of those 5 children stayed alive in whispers, in late night discussions, and in the shadows of that once busy mall. The investigation, despite all its efforts, had reached a dead end. For nearly 3 decades, it remained one of the city's deepest mysteries, a puzzle with missing pieces. Detectives who had worked the case eventually retired, still haunted by the lack of closure. Parents grew older, some passed away, still waiting for an answer that never came. The case became a reminder of how fragile safety can be, and how quickly ordinary life can turn into something unimaginable. Though the files sat in dusty archives, the story of the 5 missing children lived on in the hearts of the families and in the fearful memories of the community. No one could have imagined back in 1997 that the truth would remain hidden for so long. And no one could have guessed that almost 30 years later a discovery would come that would finally change everything. It was early in 2025, almost 28 years after the children had vanished, when the quiet of an ordinary construction site turned into the spark of a discovery that would shock the city. Workers had been renovating an old, abandoned building, just a few miles from the mall where the children disappeared. The property had been empty for years, filled with dust, broken furniture, and layers of time that seemed to hide everything inside. Nobody suspected that something so small, so ordinary, could hold answers to a mystery that had haunted generations. The workers were removing old floorboards in the basement when one of them noticed a strange shape under a layer of dust and dirt. At first, he thought it was just old storage boxes, the kind that people left behind when abandoning a property. But as he pried it open, he realized it was far more than that. Inside were neatly packed containers, each sealed tightly. The smell was faint but unmistakable, the smell of things that had been kept hidden for a long time. Curious and uneasy, the workers called their supervisor, who immediately contacted local authorities. Police arrived quickly, sealing off the site and setting up a temporary investigation zone. Word traveled fast, and reporters soon gathered, sensing that something unusual had been found. But even they could not imagine what was waiting inside. Forensic teams entered the basement carefully, wearing gloves and masks. They examined each container one by one. Inside were objects that immediately sent chills down the spine of the investigators. There were toys, small clothing items, and personal belongings that matched the descriptions of the 5 missing children. A little girl's backpack with a cartoon character, a boy's worn-out sneakers, a small collection of arcade tickets. Every item seemed to whisper the story of the children who had disappeared so many years ago. Detectives quickly realized that this was more than a coincidence. The belongings were old, clearly from the 1990s, and some had faint stains from the passage of time. But the most important step was confirmation. Samples were taken immediately for DNA testing. Forensic experts worked tirelessly, knowing that, if the results matched, it could finally solve one of the longest-running mysteries in the city's history. The news spread like wildfire. Headlines read, "New evidence in 1997 mall disappearance and breakthrough in cold case shocks city." Families who had lived decades in pain were contacted. Some could not believe what they were hearing. Mothers and fathers who had waited for nearly 30 years felt their hearts leap and their stomachs twist with hope and fear at the same time. Was this really proof that their children had been closer than anyone knew? And if so, what had happened to them? The police worked meticulously. Every inch of the basement was checked for clues. Investigators took photographs, cataloged each object, and compared them with archived evidence from 1997. Each finding was cross-referenced with old reports, eyewitness statements, and police files. Slowly, a picture began to emerge. The belongings suggested that the children had been kept nearby after their disappearance, but no living traces were found. It was as though time had been frozen in that basement, leaving behind only reminders of the past. One breakthrough came when investigators revisited the old files of the original mall investigation. Among the thousands of pages, there was a brief mention of a security guard who had been questioned in 1997, but never considered a serious suspect. The guard had worked in a section of the mall near the arcade and had been noted as observant, but unremarkable in the records. Nobody had thought he could be connected, but now, in light of the new discovery, detectives saw the first potential link. DNA samples were sent to the lab with urgency. The results confirmed the worst and the best at the same time. They matched the missing children. For the families, it was both heartbreaking and relieving. Heartbreaking because it confirmed that the children had been taken and kept hidden, and relieving because it finally gave them proof after so many years of uncertainty. The reality that had been feared for decades was finally understood, and the world that had forgotten about the mall case now had to confront it again. The discovery prompted immediate action. Investigators began retracing the old security guards' steps, looking for any sign of activity near the abandoned property. Background checks revealed that he had continued to live quietly in the city, never drawing attention to himself. Friends and neighbors spoke of him as a normal, polite person, unaware of any connection to a mystery that had shocked the city. Yet the evidence was undeniable. Somehow he had been involved, and the abandoned building contained proof of what had happened to the children. Families were given updates carefully. Police wanted to maintain accuracy while also offering hope. Emotional reunions could not yet happen, but letters were sent, visits arranged, and experts explained every step of the process. Therapists and counselors were brought in to help the families cope with the sudden revival of the tragedy. After so many years of waiting, they were finally able to understand part of the story, though many questions remained unanswered. The community responded in a mix of shock and empathy. People remembered the summer of 1997 vividly. Some had been teenagers shopping in the mall. Others had passed the building years later without realizing its secret. Stories resurfaced in newspapers and online forums, and old friends reached out to families offering support and solidarity. The city collectively felt the weight of what had been hidden for decades. Meanwhile, investigators continued to dig deeper. They conducted interviews, collected old surveillance footage, and even tried to track the movements of anyone who had worked at the mall in 1997. Every piece of evidence was examined with precision, knowing that even a small detail could reveal the final answers. Experts in cold case investigations were brought in from other states to assist. Their experience with long unsolved cases brought fresh ideas, new techniques, and a renewed sense of purpose to the investigation. The discovery in the abandoned building not only reopened the case but also changed the approach entirely. What had once been considered impossible, a clue nearly 30 years later, was now the foundation for solving the mystery. Detectives worked day and night, determined to uncover every hidden truth. They understood that the families had been waiting decades for this moment, and they refused to let time erase another opportunity. Even as the investigation advanced, the city could not stop talking about the case. Documentaries, podcasts, and news specials revisited the disappearance, bringing attention to the importance of vigilance, safety, and never giving up hope. For younger generations, it was a lesson in perseverance. For those who had lived through the original tragedy, it was a moment of emotional reckoning, a mix of grief, hope, and cautious optimism that justice might finally be within reach. By the end of 2025, the abandoned basement had become a symbol of both tragedy and revelation. What had been hidden for decades now told a story that could no longer be ignored. The lives of 5 children, once thought lost forever, had left a trail that time could not erase. And while the investigation would continue for months or even years to uncover the full truth, the discovery had already changed everything. The families, the city, and the investigators were no longer living in uncertainty. They now had proof, a foundation on which the truth could finally be built. Once the discovery in the abandoned building was confirmed, the police immediately reopened the case. What had been a cold case for almost 3 decades now became the center of intense investigation and public attention. Detectives, forensics, Experts and legal teams worked together to examine every detail, knowing that the evidence found could finally reveal the truth behind the disappearance of the 5 children. Families were contacted carefully, given updates, and reassured that everything possible would be done to uncover what had happened. The suspect, a man who had once worked as a security guard at the mall, was placed under close observation. Investigators combed through his past, checking records, interviewing neighbors, and reviewing any potential connections to other unsolved incidents. To outsiders, he had lived an ordinary life, blending into the community without raising suspicion. Yet the evidence from the abandoned building painted a very different story. For the first time, detectives had a tangible link that connected the missing children to someone who had been present at the mall on that fateful day in 1997. As the investigation unfolded, families were filled with a mix of emotions: relief that there was finally progress, sorrow for what their children had endured, and fear of the truth they might soon learn. For decades, they had imagined all sorts of scenarios, both comforting and terrifying. Now the reality of the discovery forced them to confront the possibility that their children had been close by but kept hidden, leaving them unable to return home. Despite the pain, the evidence offered hope that answers and possibly closure were finally within reach. Police worked tirelessly to reconstruct the events of that day. They studied old photographs, mall layouts, and employee schedules to understand how the children might have been taken unnoticed. Modern forensic techniques allowed them to analyze the sealed containers, the clothing, and even small remnants found inside the abandoned building. Each item revealed subtle details: a fabric tear here, a faint fingerprint there, that helped detectives build a timeline of what had occurred after the children disappeared from the mall. Meanwhile, media coverage surged. News outlets ran stories on the new evidence, and documentaries revisited the 1997 disappearance with a renewed focus. Viewers were captivated by the developments, and social media filled with messages of support for the families. People shared their memories of that summer long ago, reflecting on how the city had been shaken by the tragedy. Yet even as attention grew, the police remained focused, determined to solve the case carefully and accurately. Interviews with former mall employees provided additional context. Some remembered the suspect as quiet and unassuming, never drawing attention, while others recalled small, unusual behaviors that had gone unnoticed at the time. Each recollection was analyzed to see if it could explain how the suspect might have been involved without being detected. For investigators, the combination of old testimony and new evidence created a clearer picture than had ever existed before. DNA results confirmed the identities of the missing children beyond doubt. For the families, the confirmation was overwhelming. It was both a moment of grief and a moment of clarity. Grief because it reminded them of the years lost and the uncertainty they had endured. Clarity because it finally proved that their children had existed within reach, hidden in ways they could not have imagined. Many parents found themselves crying, holding on to the framed photographs they had kept for decades, whispering the children's names as if calling them home one last time. Legal teams prepared carefully for the next steps. Arrests and charges would need to be handled delicately, ensuring that the evidence was solid and the case could stand in court. Prosecutors reviewed every detail, reconstructing the story from 1997 and linking it to the physical evidence discovered in 2025. Witness testimonies, archival documents, and forensic findings were all compiled into a detailed case that left little room for doubt. The goal was clear: justice for the children and their families. As the investigation progressed, the city watched closely. Public interest remained high, and community members offered support in various ways. Some attended vigils, holding candles, and pictures of the missing children. Others shared stories of the family's resilience, reminding everyone that hope could survive even the darkest years. The story, once a forgotten tragedy, had become a symbol of perseverance, patience, and the power of truth. The suspect, now an elderly man, was finally confronted by the authorities. Careful planning ensured the operation was safe and effective, aiming to bring him into custody without incident. During questioning, investigators meticulously presented the evidence, reconstructing the events step by step. The suspects' responses were recorded and any inconsistencies were noted, providing critical insight into how the children had been taken and kept hidden. The process was slow and deliberate, but every detail brought the investigators closer to a full understanding of the crime. For the families, each day brought a mixture of anxiety and hope. They had lived decades with unanswered questions, and now every new detail brought both relief and sorrow. They met with counselors to help process the emotions that had been buried for so long, and support groups formed to share experiences, coping strategies, and memories. The city itself seemed to pause in reflection, acknowledging the pain of the families and the perseverance of the investigators who had refused to let the case fade into obscurity. Community leaders and educators began using the case as an example of vigilance and the importance of looking out for one another. Safety protocols in public places were reviewed, security measures were strengthened, and programs for missing children awareness gained renewed attention. The tragedy, while still heartbreaking, had inspired meaningful change, ensuring that future generations would benefit from lessons learned over decades of investigation. Finally, after months of meticulous work, the authorities were able to reconstruct the final timeline of events. The evidence showed how the suspect had used his position at the mall to move unnoticed, how the children had been taken and kept hidden, and how decades of silence had allowed the mystery to remain unsolved. While some details remained unclear, the families now had answers that had eluded them for almost 30 years. They understood what had happened, and they could begin to grieve fully, with knowledge replacing uncertainty. The case's reopening and the discoveries of 2025 brought closure that had once seemed impossible. Families who had lived with empty seats at tables and silent bedrooms could finally begin to heal. The city, too, found a sense of resolution, knowing that even long-forgotten mysteries could be solved. Investigators were praised for their perseverance, and the story of the 5 missing children became a testament to the idea that time could hide secrets, but truth could never be buried forever. Though the pain would never entirely vanish, the families were finally able to reclaim a sense of peace. They could honor their children's memories, share their stories, and ensure that the lessons learned from this tragedy would remain alive for generations to come. And for everyone who had been touched by the disappearance of the Mall 5, the case became a reminder of hope, resilience, and the relentless pursuit of justice, proving that even the longest shadows of uncertainty can eventually give way to light.